Nearly 4,000 years ago, a violent disaster struck a settlement near the Yellow River. Homes collapsed, mud buried the village, and people, pottery, and everyday objects disappeared beneath the earth. Inside one ruined house, a clay bowl was knocked upside down. Beneath it were thin strands of food, preserved in darkness for thousands of years. They were made from millet, stretched into long strands, and boiled in water, one of the oldest bowls of noodles ever discovered. The disaster destroyed an entire community, but it preserved someone's dinner. That buried meal would later become evidence in one of the most disputed stories in food history. Who invented noodles? And how did flour and water become a food eaten across almost every civilization on Earth? And if you enjoy discovering the hidden history behind the foods we see every day, consider subscribing. There are many more familiar things with extraordinary stories still waiting to be uncovered. Long before noodles became thin strands in a bowl, humans had already spent thousands of years learning how to transform hard grains into edible food. Millet, wheat, and rice could not simply be eaten straight from the field. They had to be dried, crushed, mixed with water, and exposed to heat. The earliest solutions were simple: porridge, flatbread, or thick dough cooked over fire. But dividing that dough into smaller pieces created an important advantage. Thin strips or small fragments, cooked faster, required less fuel, and could absorb the flavor of broth, meat, vegetables, or spices. This was the true beginning of noodles, not a single recipe, but a new way of processing grain. Once people understood that dough could be stretched, cut, pinched, or torn before boiling, they had created a food that was cheap, adaptable, and easy to serve. The exact shape could change, but the basic idea was powerful enough to survive for millennia. The buried bowl at Lajia offers the clearest glimpse of how early this idea had developed. The yellow strands discovered inside were about 4,000 years old and made from two varieties of millet, a grain widely cultivated in northern China before wheat became dominant. That detail surprised researchers, because millet lacks the strong gluten network that makes modern wheat dough easy to stretch. Recreating those noodles would have required careful grinding, controlled moisture, and a technique capable of forming long strands without causing them to collapse. The exact method remains uncertain, but the discovery proved that prehistoric communities were already doing far more than boiling grain into porridge. They were transforming it into a shaped, textured food. Yet the Lajia bowl did not settle the question of who invented noodles. It only provided the oldest direct physical evidence so far, and opened a much larger debate food for a growing civilization. But the deeper historians looked, the harder it became to name a single inventor. China possessed the oldest direct archaeological evidence, yet similar foods made from rolled, cut, or boiled dough also appeared across Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. Much of the confusion came from the word noodle itself. Did it mean only a long strand, or could it include sheets, strips, and small pieces of dough cooked in water? The answer changed depending on culture and period. This uncertainty also weakened one of the most famous stories in food history: that Marco Polo introduced pasta to Italy after returning from China. Pasta was already known around the Mediterranean before his journey. The history of noodles, therefore, looked less like a single invention traveling outward from one birthplace, and more like several societies discovering related solutions to the same problem: how to turn flour and water into food that was quick to cook, easy to store, and satisfying to eat. Whether these traditions developed independently or influenced one another, noodles became especially valuable as cities grew. Dough could be prepared in advance, divided into individual portions, and cooked within minutes in a pot of boiling water. This made it ideal for crowded markets, roadside stalls, workshops, and military camps where people needed hot food without waiting for bread to bake or meat to roast. A small amount of vegetables, fat, or meat could flavor an entire bowl of broth, allowing sellers to stretch expensive ingredients across many customers. In northern Chinese cities, noodle shops became part of everyday urban life, serving merchants, laborers, travelers, and officials from the same steaming pots. The dish could remain humble or become elaborate, depending on what was added. This flexibility gave noodles an unusual social range. They could feed the poor cheaply, yet also appear at banquets prepared with refined broths, rare spices, and carefully shaped strands. As merchants, soldiers, and migrants moved across Asia, they carried more than silk, spices, and precious metals. They also carried wheat, milling tools, cooking methods, and knowledge of how dough could be stretched, cut, dried, or boiled. Across Central Asia, noodle traditions developed along the great trade routes connecting China, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Dishes such as hand-pulled legmen reflected this constant exchange, combining techniques that may have traveled while adapting to local meat, vegetables, and seasonings. Yet noodles rarely arrived as a finished recipe. Each community reshaped them according to the grain it could grow, the fuel it could afford, and the flavors people preferred. In some places, noodles became thick and chewy. Elsewhere, they were thin, delicate, or dried for travel. Their spread was not a simple journey from one country to another. It was a long process of borrowing, adaptation, and reinvention. In the Mediterranean, one adaptation would give noodles an entirely new advantage: long-term preservation. Fresh dough spoiled quickly, especially in warm climates. But pasta made from durum wheat could be shaped and dried until most of its moisture was removed. Once hardened, it could survive storage, travel, and long sea voyages, far better than fresh noodles. This made dried pasta especially valuable in port cities, where merchants needed food that was compact, durable, and easy to prepare. By the medieval period, forms of dried pasta were already being produced and traded in parts of the Mediterranean, long before Marco Polo returned from Asia. Over time, workshops developed presses and molds that created increasingly consistent shapes. Each form behaved differently in boiling water and held sauce in a different way. Pasta was no longer only a meal prepared for immediate consumption. It had become a transportable commodity, one that could move through markets, ships, and expanding trade networks without losing its usefulness. While dried pasta expanded through Mediterranean trade, other regions were transforming noodles around different crops. Across much of East and Southeast Asia, rice was more abundant than wheat, so cooks learned to grind soaked rice into batter, steam it into sheets, and cut or extrude it into strands. These methods produced noodles with a softer, lighter texture than wheat noodles, and allowed them to absorb clear broths, fish sauces, herbs, and spices. In Vietnam, rice noodles became the foundation of dishes such as pho and bún. In southern China, similar techniques created delicate rice noodles suited to warmer climates and rice-growing economies. The basic principle remained the same, but the grain changed everything: texture, color, cooking time, and even the flavors served alongside it. Noodles survived because they did not demand one ingredient or one tradition. They adapted to whatever each society could grow, trade, and afford. Japan provides another example of how borrowed techniques could become entirely new traditions. Wheat noodles such as udon developed into thick, soft strands served in simple broths, while soba used buckwheat, a crop that could grow in poorer soils and colder regions where rice was less reliable. Ramen arrived much later, influenced by Chinese wheat noodles, but transformed through Japanese tastes, local broths, and regional competition. By the early 20th century, noodle shops were serving bowls built around pork, seafood, soy sauce, miso, and other ingredients that varied from city to city. These dishes were not copies of one original recipe. They were local responses to available crops, working-class demand, and changing urban life. By this point, noodles had become more than a method of cooking grain. They had become cultural identities, with each region claiming its own textures, toppings, and traditions, while still relying on the same basic union of flour, water, and heat. By the 19th century, industrialization began changing noodles as dramatically as agriculture once had. Mechanical mills produced finer and more consistent flour, while mixers, rollers, cutters, and extrusion presses replaced much of the slow handwork that had defined noodle making for centuries. Factories could now produce thousands of identical strands or pasta shapes in a single day, controlling thickness, moisture, and cooking time with far greater precision. Railways and steamships carried dried noodles into distant markets, while sealed packaging protected them from insects and humidity. This reduced prices and made noodles available year-round, even in places far from the fields where their grain was grown. But standardization also changed what people expected from food. Handmade variation gradually gave way to uniform texture, predictable flavor, and recognizable brands. Noodles were no longer only local traditions shaped by individual cooks. They were becoming industrial products designed for mass distribution. The next major transformation came in Japan after the Second World War. Cities were crowded, food supplies were unstable, and millions of people needed meals that were cheap, filling, and fast. Wheat imported into Japan became increasingly important, while ramen stalls offered hot bowls to workers rebuilding the country. Yet traditional ramen still required fresh noodles, broth, fuel, and time. It could be served quickly in a shop, but it was not truly convenient outside one. This problem attracted Momofuku Ando, an entrepreneur who believed that a shelf-stable noodle could help feed people during periods of shortage. He began experimenting in a small backyard shed, testing different ways to dry cooked noodles without destroying their texture. His goal was deceptively simple: create a product that could survive for months, travel anywhere, and return to something resembling fresh noodles after only a few minutes in hot water. After months of failure, Ando found his solution by observing how hot oil rapidly removed moisture from food. He cooked the noodles, seasoned them, and then flash-fried them, forcing water out while leaving behind countless tiny pores. When hot water was added later, those pores allowed the noodles to absorb moisture and soften again within minutes. In 1958, he introduced chicken ramen, the world's first commercially successful instant noodles. At first, the product was more expensive than fresh noodles, and some consumers viewed it as a novelty rather than an everyday meal. But its advantages were difficult to ignore. It required no refrigeration, lasted for months, and needed little more than boiling water. A food that had once depended on skilled hands, fresh ingredients, and a working kitchen could now be stored on a shelf and prepared almost anywhere. Ando had not invented noodles. He had removed their final limits of time and place. The next breakthrough came after Ando visited the United States and watched people break instant noodles into paper cups before adding hot water. The container itself, he realized, could solve several problems at once. In 1971, Nissin launched cup noodles, placing the dried noodle block, seasonings, and toppings inside a lightweight waterproof cup. Consumers no longer needed a bowl, and the package became both storage container and cooking vessel. This seemingly small change made instant noodles far easier to sell in offices, schools, factories, convenience stores, and countries where traditional noodle bowls were less familiar. Manufacturers then adapted flavors to local markets, producing versions inspired by curry, seafood, beef, kimchi, and regional spices. Noodles had always survived by absorbing local traditions, but industrial production accelerated that process. A recipe could now be redesigned, packaged, and distributed to millions of people across several continents. By the late 20th century, instant noodles had become one of the most widely distributed convenience foods on Earth. Their success came from a combination few products could match. They were inexpensive, lightweight, shelf-stable, and familiar enough to adapt to almost any cuisine. Students used them in dormitories, factory workers ate them during short breaks, travelers carried them across borders, and families kept them as emergency food. In regions struck by earthquakes, floods, or war, instant noodles were often included in relief supplies because large quantities could be transported quickly and stored without refrigeration. Yet their global spread also revealed something about modern life. People were not only choosing noodles because they enjoyed them. Many relied on them because they lacked money, cooking facilities, or time. The ancient advantage of noodles, turning simple grain into a fast, filling meal, had been redesigned for a world where convenience was no longer a luxury, but often a necessity. Today, noodles exist in nearly every form imaginable: fresh, dried, frozen, fried, steamed, filled, and packaged for instant preparation. Global brands compete beside small family workshops, while traditional noodle shops continue to preserve techniques that machines cannot fully reproduce. In one city, noodles may be stretched by hand and served in broth. In another, they may be pressed into hundreds of pasta shapes or cut from sheets of rice dough. This variety is the reason noodles have never belonged to only one culture. Yet the modern market is increasingly dominated by products designed for speed, long shelf life, and strong flavor. Instant noodles in particular are often engineered with refined flour, oil, salt, and concentrated seasoning. They remain useful, affordable, and convenient, but convenience can hide what is missing. A bowl may feel complete while providing little fiber, few vegetables, and limited protein, unless other ingredients are added. This does not mean noodles themselves are unhealthy. Their nutritional value depends on the type of flour, the portion, the seasoning, and what is served with them. Fresh wheat noodles, rice noodles, soba, pasta, and instant noodles can all fit into a balanced diet, but they should not be treated as complete meals on their own. A simple bowl becomes more nourishing when combined with eggs, tofu, lean meat, seafood, beans, or other sources of protein. Vegetables, mushrooms, and fresh herbs can add fiber, vitamins, and texture. With instant noodles, using only part of the seasoning packet or leaving some of the broth behind can reduce the amount of salt consumed. Whole grain pasta or noodles made partly from buckwheat may also provide more fiber than products made entirely from refined flour. The real concern is not eating noodles occasionally. It is allowing convenience to replace variety across the entire diet. Salt is one of the clearest reasons moderation matters. Much of it is concentrated in the seasoning powder and broth, rather than in the noodles themselves, which is why drinking every drop can significantly increase the total consumed. Fried instant noodles may also contain more fat than fresh or air-dried varieties, although the exact amount varies widely between brands. Reading the nutrition label can help consumers compare sodium, fat, protein, and serving size instead of assuming every package is nutritionally identical. Preparation also matters. Boiling the noodles separately, discarding the first water, or adding only part of the seasoning can reduce some of the heaviness, while vegetables and protein make the meal more complete. None of these changes transform instant noodles into perfect health food, but they make a practical difference. The healthiest approach is not complete avoidance. It is understanding that noodles are a base. What surrounds them determines whether the bowl is merely convenient or genuinely nourishing. The healthiest noodle traditions often reveal something modern convenience has forgotten. Noodles were rarely meant to stand alone. Across cultures, they were paired with broth, vegetables, fermented foods, herbs, seafood, eggs, or small amounts of meat, creating meals that balanced starch with other nutrients and textures. Industrial packaging separated the noodles from that larger food culture and sold them as a complete meal, even when they were not. Rebuilding that balance does not require abandoning convenience. It may be as simple as adding frozen vegetables, using leftover chicken, cracking in an egg, or choosing a smaller portion alongside other foods. The goal is not to turn every bowl into a perfect nutritional formula. It is to remember that noodles are most useful as a foundation, rather than the entire diet. For thousands of years, their strength came from adaptability. That same adaptability can still make them healthier today. Nearly 4,000 years after the settlement at Lagia disappeared beneath mud and earth, the overturned bowl found there still captures the entire history of noodles in a single image. It began as a practical way to transform grain into something warm, filling, and easy to eat. From millet strands in ancient China to dried pasta in the Mediterranean, rice noodles in Southeast Asia, ramen in Japan, and instant cups sold around the world, every society reshaped noodles according to its crops, technology, and way of life. No single country created every form, and no single recipe explains their success. Noodles endured because they could change. Today, that same flexibility allows them to be either a balanced meal or little more than refined starch, salt, and convenience. The choice depends on what we add, how often we eat them, and whether speed has replaced variety. The bowl survived the disaster. The question now is how wisely we use what it preserved.